Brian Entin did not arrive at this lead through a whisper or an anonymous tip. He found it by following a paper trail buried inside Nancy Guthrie's financial history. During a review of her records, one transaction stood out and pointed investigators somewhere they had not truly been looking before. It led south to Mexico, and more specifically to an account associated with a property services company operating along a coastal region. On its face, the business did not appear glamorous or obvious. It was not a major hotel brand, not a luxury resort group, and not a company that would naturally intersect with Nancy Guthrie's life in Tucson, Arizona. Yet weeks before she disappeared, her money landed there. The transfer was substantial, and those familiar with Nancy's normal financial habits reportedly saw it as deeply uncharacteristic. It did not resemble a casual vacation expense or an ordinary payment. It looked deliberate, focused, and unexplained. That is what makes the transaction so important. The most pressing question is not simply why the money moved. It is what Nancy believed she was paying to obtain. From a forensic standpoint, an out-of-character international transfer in a victim's account is not just a financial curiosity. It can reveal intent, planning, and hidden lines of inquiry. Financial forensics had already uncovered meaningful clues elsewhere in this case, particularly on Annie Guthrie's side of the ledger, where investigators identified financial strain, unusual cash withdrawals, a large, unexplained deposit, and transfers within the family. Those findings helped define what investigators believe was the financial landscape surrounding Nancy's death. Nancy's own financial records were already part of the case file. They had been examined for connections to estate planning, insurance, beneficiary structures, and property interests, all elements investigators believed formed part of the underlying motive. The Mexico transaction was apparently visible in those records from the start, but it was not initially recognized as critical. Bank records preserve what happened, but they do not explain significance on their own. Early reviewers were focused on other patterns, and this transfer may not have stood out until later. Once identified, however, its importance grew immediately. In the same compressed stretch of time when Nancy was reviewing her will, inquiring about her insurance policy, changing beneficiary designations, contacting a sheriff, and calling a property manager in coastal Mexico about a specific vacant address, she also sent a large sum to a Mexico-based property services company. The payment does not exist as an isolated anomaly. It belongs to a larger behavioral pattern. That pattern suggests Nancy was doing far more than taking vague, defensive measures. In her final weeks, she appeared to be carrying out a private and methodical operation. Quietly, and apparently without drawing attention from those around her, she was trying to confirm or uncover something she believed existed in Mexico. The nature of the company receiving the money is where the investigative stakes become even higher. A property services company in coastal Mexico could, in theory, be engaged in many entirely legitimate activities. Such firms may handle property management, maintenance, rental administration, title work, or documentation for foreign owners navigating the local legal system. Any American dealing with real estate in Mexico might reasonably hire such a company for ordinary reasons. But this payment does not appear to fit that kind of routine scenario. The company's profile, as reportedly examined by Entin and now by investigators, does not seem to match a standard tourist-facing or vacation rental business. Instead, it appears to align with a more specialized category of service, one capable of researching specific properties, documenting their condition, tracing ownership history, and identifying who may have accessed them and when. That detail matters because it mirrors exactly the kind of information Nancy seemed to be seeking when she contacted the property manager about a vacant address. She was not asking about booking a stay or arranging a purchase. She appeared to be asking questions about status, activity, and recent presence. A specialized property services firm could provide something far more formal than a local contact's recollection. It could produce documentation. Taken together, the property manager calls and the money transfer suggest a coherent strategy. The calls look like reconnaissance, Nancy repeatedly contacted someone with local knowledge and asked whether anyone had recently been at a specific vacant property. That was a low-visibility way to begin gathering information. The payment to the property services company appears to represent the next phase, an escalation from informal inquiry to professional investigation. That raises a crucial possibility. If Nancy moved from discreet phone calls to paying a significant fee for formal investigative work, something may have happened during those early conversations that convinced her the matter required documentation. The simplest explanation is that she learned the property was not as untouched as it appeared, and that someone had indeed been there. If so, that answer may have been significant enough to push her into hiring professionals. A company with that kind of capability can do much more than manage property. It can photograph a location, document signs of recent activity, note the condition of locks and access points, and determine whether utilities are active. It can search public property records, reconstruct a chain of title and identify transfers or encumbrances. It can speak with neighbors and local sources. It can build a time-stamped factual record of what exists at a specific address and who is connected to it. That is not a tourism service. It is an evidentiary package. It is the kind of material that could be useful in a legal proceeding, in a law enforcement disclosure, or in a private investigation designed to prove that a property, its use, or its ownership was being concealed. If Nancy was paying for that kind of work, then she was not sending money for leisure or convenience. She was apparently funding the collection of evidence. Professional, documented, verifiable evidence tied to a particular property in coastal Mexico that she believed had some connection to her situation. What remains unclear is what exactly she expected that evidence to show. The timing of all this may be the most revealing part. Nancy's final weeks were crowded with purposeful activity. She was reviewing her will, asking questions about insurance, changing beneficiaries, discussing property issues, calling a Mexico-based property manager, trying to contact the sheriff, sending a post-dinner text, and now, based on this financial record, paying a Mexican property services company. These were not isolated events, unfolding one after another. They were happening at the same time. That simultaneity is forensically powerful because it suggests Nancy understood she was working against a narrowing window. She was not pulling one thread and waiting to see where it led. She was moving on multiple fronts at once. She appeared to be addressing the domestic, legal, and financial structure through her estate actions, attempting law enforcement contact through the sheriff, maintaining a trusted communication line through her text, and pursuing the Mexico angle through calls and payment. A person acting that way is not operating on instinct alone. She appears to have understood that the situation was broader than a single property in Tucson or a dispute over insurance and estate arrangements. She seemed to believe there was a Mexico component to what was happening around her, and she pursued that line with the same urgency and structure she applied to everything else. Entin's discovery also says something about the investigation itself. Financial records in a case like this are massive. Years of checking accounts, savings histories, card statements, transfers, and related records can generate thousands of entries. Early forensic reviews usually concentrate on the period immediately before the critical event and on transaction categories already known to matter. A payment to a foreign business might be flagged right away, or it might simply be noted and left unexplored if investigators had not yet identified that country as relevant. If Mexico was not yet a defined dimension of the case when Nancy's records were first reviewed, the transaction may have seemed peripheral. But once Entin connected it to the property services sector and to the same geographic area reflected in Nancy's phone activity, its meaning changed dramatically. What emerged was not a random international payment, but a purposeful transfer to a company capable of carrying out the exact kind of work Nancy appeared to need. That is why the Mexico thread no longer looks incidental. The property manager calls point there. The financial transfer points there. Both appear to center on the same coastal area and the same investigative objective. That kind of overlap is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. It looks more like deliberate focus. The recipient company reportedly operates in a specific coastal region of Mexico, not in a famous resort corridor, but in the same general zone tied to the vacant address Nancy had been asking about. The sum involved was reportedly large enough to suggest a serious engagement rather than a casual request for information. If that is correct, Nancy did not merely inquire about a property. She hired someone to investigate it, and that possibility opens a major question for investigators. The company still exists. Its files may still exist as well. If work had already begun in response to Nancy's payment, there could be records showing what address she asked them to examine, what they were told to find, what steps they took, and what they discovered before she disappeared. There may be emails, call logs, photographs, draft reports, or internal notes that never made it back to her. Through formal cooperation with Mexican authorities, investigators may be able to obtain those records and interview the people involved. If so, the company becomes more than a business tied to a transfer. It becomes a professional witness, one that may have been in the middle of documenting something for Nancy when her investigation was abruptly cut off. That also deepens the significance of the broader Mexico connection. There was already reporting about a border crossing record. If Nancy truly was investigating something in coastal Mexico, that crossing may not have been a false trail at all. It may instead reflect her own intention to take the next step, whether to meet the property manager, speak with the company she had hired, or see the vacant address herself. If that is true, then the question becomes even more devastating. What happened to Nancy before she could make that trip, before she could finish assembling what she was building, and before she could place the domestic and Mexico pieces together into one full account? That appears to be where the investigation now turns. The immediate priority would be the records of the property services company. What did Nancy tell them? What property were they directed toward? What had they already learned? The second major priority would be ownership records for the vacant address itself. Who held title? When was it acquired? And does the chain of ownership connect in any way to names already circulating in the domestic investigation, whether Annie Tommaso, a family associate, or someone within the financial network investigators have been mapping? Everything about Nancy's actions suggests she was not acting out of idle curiosity. She appeared to be building a case, not a public case and not yet a formal one, but a private, carefully financed, increasingly comprehensive case that included estate actions, attempted law enforcement contact, and professional investigative work in another country. The implication is that she intended to bring all of it together. If Nancy was preparing to go to the sheriff with both domestic documentation and evidence from Mexico, then someone may have recognized how close she was to doing exactly that. The large transfer to a company with investigative capabilities now reads less like an isolated financial oddity and more like the opening move in the final phase of what she was constructing. That is why the central question is no longer about the transfer itself. It is about what stood at the end of it. What was at that address in coastal Mexico? What was that company in the process of documenting? What did Nancy believe was waiting there that mattered enough to pursue across borders, in secret, while simultaneously reorganizing the rest of her life? Investigators now appear determined to find out. Whatever was tied to that property, whoever's name may ultimately be attached to it, and whatever connection it may have to the financial arrangements investigators believe were structured around Nancy's death, the Mexico dimension has expanded the case beyond Tucson. The picture is no longer confined by geography, and the assumption that the border marked the limit of the inquiry may prove to have been badly mistaken. Brian Entin followed the money to Mexico. Now the investigation appears to be following that trail as well.